Starstruck.
Well, hello and welcome to Joyride. I am Jared Brandon Flandy, and
I am Adam Mendenhall.
this is the show where we discuss all things regarding vehicles and adventure. All right, and I'd like to also point out that this is the season final of Season 2, Adam.
It is already. It went fast.
So, the last hint I gave, if you hadn't guessed, is that we're going to be covering hot air balloons today, which is why we're going to be flying high. And this is Oregon, where certain things are legalized. I'm not referring to that. I'd also like to point out.
Exactly.
Oh, with that said, are we ready to begin our little tour of aviation history and adventure?
I believe we are.
Okay. Bringing up the script. For thousands of years, humans have closed their eyes and dreamed of soaring through the white clouds of the turquoise sky that was far above the beds they were sleeping in. Little did our ancestors know that one day it would no longer be a dream. Even though the age of the airplane would not begin until the early 20th century, humans managed to venture into the blue yonder hundreds of years earlier with the invention of the hot air balloon. The hot air balloon can trace its origins as far back as ancient China, when floating lanterns were used for military units in order to communicate with one another from great distances. Aviation would also be in the minds of such visionaries as Leonardo Da Vinci. Leonardo's notebooks feature sketches of his flying machines that he drew in the 15th century. However, the idea of an airship may have first been envisioned by a Brazilian Portuguese priest, Bartolomeu do Gazmo.
Well, that is a mouthful.
That's
right there.
my best educated guess, and I took a year of Spanish too. So I know this is Portuguese, but
Still, yeah.
but Bartolomeu never got the opportunity to build his airship. So that guy's like, excuse me, are you working on the sermon this Sunday? He's like shuffling these rocks away.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm right on that. Just give me a few more minutes.
The first true aircraft and a hot air balloon was invented by two Frenchmen, Joseph Michel Montgolfier and Jacques Etienne Montgolfier, better known collectively as the Montgolfier brothers.
Interesting.
Their family owned a paper business, and the knowledge of stationery would be instrumental in helping the brothers achieve their aeronautical ambitions. Now, I think things have changed a little bit. You don't walk into Boeing going, well, sir, what are your qualifications? I'm great with folding paper. I can make paper airplanes.
Yeah, a little bit more of a screening process today, to say the least.
Consequently, Joseph initially began experimenting with flight in 1775 by constructing his own parachutes. With no airplanes existing at the time, he would test his parachutes by jumping off the roof of the family house.
Oh my gosh.
It's like they're sitting there having breakfast, the family, there's that window that's looking out, and you just see this kid come down and thunk.
Yeah. Yeah, what's he jumping into? He's just jumping off the roof.
Even though Joseph was having fun jumping off his roof, he wanted to do more. In an odd twist of fate, the inspiration for modern aviation came from one of the world's most mundane activities, laundry. After washing his clothes, Joseph took his garments and set them close to the fire to dry. As they dried, he noticed something peculiar. The heat and smoke from the flames would cause certain pockets of the fabric to lift as it dried by the flames.
Huh.
This simple observation would lead to the birth of the entire aviation industry. With this surprising source of inspiration, the brothers set to work by experimenting with a series of small balloons. Their first test flight was in the winter of 1782 and proved to be a success. A little too successful. The lift from the fires caused the brothers to lose control of the craft as it flew away on its own. They later found it destroyed, possibly by someone who did not know what it was. So some guy probably saw this thing, because you've probably never seen anything fly in your life other than a bird.
Well, yeah, there's an early UFO right there.
Yeah, exactly. Panic because it was some sky demon or something.
What is that?
In time, they would show that the world what they'd been working on by having the first public demonstration of a hot air balloon. It occurred on June 4th, 1783, and was held in front of the highest social circles of Ancien Regime France. The balloon itself was made from an extraordinarily large piece of taffeta and was as blue as the sky as it would soar through.
And just to, not to interrupt, but taffeta, for those of us that don't know, what material is that from that era?
It's either fabric or paper. I honestly am not sure the difference.
That's interesting. Interesting material.
Yep. If you do know that, phone it now. It also featured gold accents and hand-painted symbols of the zodiac upon it, perhaps to invoke the celestial nature of the project. To ensure a certain amount of safety, the balloon was simply tethered to the ground in order to control the flight, but it was still a proof of concept in many ways. For the first time in human history, it was suggested that humans may be able to say goodbye to the comfortable soil of the planet they call home. With this success, they progressed to the next step. The Montgolfier brothers now wanted to send people to travel in their balloon. However, there was one problem. Up to this point, no human had ever experienced traveling at a high altitude, so no one knew if it would have poor effects on a person's body. They just don't know. I mean, no one has ever been above, other than maybe a mountain setting where you've climatized to it. No one's done it quickly.
Exactly. How far up can we actually still breathe? A lot of unknowns.
They didn't know if they would explode or something due to pressures. The King of France, Louis XVI, who had taken notice of the brothers' invention, initially suggested using convicted criminals to test possible effects flight would have upon the human body. Even though criminals were offered, the Montgolfier brothers did not like this idea and suggested using animals instead. So I suppose a lesser of two evils.
That's interesting. So they were using animals as the test pilots, even that far back, before Sputnik here, far before. Yeah.
With this stipulation in mind, the world's first aviators were a rooster, a duck, and a sheep dubbed Montaciel, which roughly translates as "climb to the sky."
Oh my God.
Here are, I know Mr. Bezos just recently went into space, but these were the first initial individuals that led to that progression.
Oh my gosh.
The demonstration flight was garnished with every ingredient worthy of a royal welcome since it was held outside the Palace of Versailles. Along with the curious crowd, also in attendance was King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. The flight would be a success. The barnyard crew had flown 3 kilometers, or 2 miles, and reached an altitude of 460 meters, or about 1,500 feet. The crew had not suffered any health problems, which was enough to encourage the next step, a piloted human flight. So unlike the dog in the Soviet program, no animals were harmed in this flight.
No, they were treated well.
In the fall of 1783, Etienne Montgolfier, in a tethered hot air balloon, became the first person to leave the Earth. Despite this success, this was not enough for the pioneering aviators. For them, the sky was not the limit. Next time, their balloon would carry humans without anything tying them down. The brothers took a step back from being pilots and instead directed the intrepid team of Jean-François Pilatre du Rosier and military officer François Laurent Duallon. I'm trying. I feel like I'm reading off a menu, but today's specials
definitely gives you the French feel.
To embark upon the world's first free flight. The team set off on November 21st, 1783. This balloon was adorned with many decorations, including the face of the king. No ego issues or kiss-assery occurring here. Yeah.
Nope, just moving forward with the project.
Overall, the flight would be a success despite some minor setbacks. Balloons at this early point in history relied upon fire as a source of fuel in order to achieve flight. As clever as this was, it proved to have its drawbacks when Rosier and Duallon noticed that embers from the fire were burning the material of the balloon. Oh, so I can hear, "Sacre bleu! It is on fire!"
Just trying to imagine the imagery of that as you got these little ambers going up and then actually igniting the material.
Okay, imagine being someone below. You're just seeing this flaming thing with these two screaming Frenchmen just running around in circles in a tiny little basket. I mean,
yeah, needless to say, that would make you a little concerned.
They first used sponges to soften the burns, but when it became more serious, Rosier was forced to remove his coat in order to put out the flames in mid-flight.
Jeez.
That's a callback to our last episode. It seems like our inventors keep setting themselves accidentally on fire.
It does seem to be a trend, especially at this point in time.
Yeah. As a result, they had to land early, even though they had enough fuel to fly much longer. It did not matter. The flight was successful and managed to achieve a record flight duration of 25 minutes. Legend says when they had landed, the aeronauts celebrated their achievement by opening a bottle of champagne, a tradition that is still practiced by balloonists to this day.
Interesting. Kind of, similar to shipbuilders to an extent.
Yeah.
The celebration of the completion of a project and sending it on its way.
They do the like car races. I wonder if that's where that comes from too.
That's
true. The
true.
ships and the balloons. Yep. I don't know, but yeah.
Who was first?
With this success, the Montgolfier brothers decided to quit while they were ahead and did not pursue any major aviation attempts at this point. Aside from their contribution to flight, the Montgolfier brothers' legacy continues to live on with their paper company that is still in business, but now under the name of Canson. They produce some of the world's best fine art paper.
Oh, wow.
Just a fun fact. I thought it was an odd juncture. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty rare for something like that to survive, and that's what they originally,
started out as.
They started out as, yeah.
Monsieur Rosier would attempt to make even more history when he decided to cross the English Channel in a balloon. This flight was different than Rosier's previous endeavors because this time he was now using hydrogen to make the balloon fly.
Oh, big step forward.
Much like the Hindenburg, this flight would have fatal consequences when the balloon exploded over the channel, killing Rosier in the process.
Oh, my gosh.
Don't use hydrogen as a lift substance. It'd be a number of years later, but another pair of aviators would attempt what was considered to be the world's longest flight, crossing the channel. Two men decided to take the challenge in 1793. Frenchman Jean-Pierre Blanchard and American John Jeffries. I can say that one at least. They would successfully travel to England, starting a tradition of crossing the English Channel that continues to this day, but primarily with airplanes. Blanchard would even experience success in the newly formed United States when he became the first person in the country to fly a balloon. He ascended from a prison yard in Philadelphia with George Washington in attendance. Now, I thought that was an odd place to have it.
That is.
Excuse me, Mr. Washington. Yeah, I'd like to show you my new invention. I was just wondering, where could I have it? I was thinking like a nice park, maybe in front of your monument.
Yeah.
No, how about we do it at Shawshank?
Yes, that will be the spot.
Blanchard would fly from Philadelphia and would eventually land in Gloucester County, New Jersey. I'm not sure if they talked like that back then, but I'm just going to assume so. Unfortunately, Blanchard would experience a premature death when he fell from his balloon as a result of a heart attack in 1808.
Wow.
Now, I'm not trying to make a dark humor here, but that reminds me, did you ever watch a fish called Wanda?
Oh, yes, I did.
Did you know that there was this Danish guy that was watching it, and he was laughing so hard it caused a heart problem, and he had a heart attack, so he literally died from laughing.
That is a fun fact I did not know. Well, not so fun, but wow.
And John Cleese almost thought about using it as marketing. So funny, you'll die from laughing. But he's like, no, that's a little too bad.
Yeah, that'd be taking it a little too far. But wow, yeah.
Blanchard's unique position as the only aviator in North America would not last long, however. Other aviators would follow, and this time their motivation would not come from simple curiosity, but instead from war. In 1860, the United States began war with itself for the first time. The American Civil War eventually would be considered the world's first industrialized war, and one of the most deadly in American history, rivaling both world wars it would be involved with later in the 20th century. Thaddeus S.C. Lowe of the Union Army would change history by using tethered balloons in order to spy upon the Confederate armies of the South. His work with flight reconnaissance is considered to be one of the innovative factors that helped the United States abolish slavery, promote progressive thought, and preserve the Union during the Civil War. So it sounds kind of low tech, but no one really has the ability to get up high and get a bird's eye view of what's going on in the battlefield, essentially.
No, not back then. We'll talk about a huge, technical advantage, tactical advantage with something like that in that era.
The Civil War would end in 1865, but scientific innovations would continue to gather momentum. The Victoria era would result in achievements such as the SS Great Britain, which we discussed in the last episode, and even after the death of Victoria in 1901, scientific progress refused to stop when the Wright brothers achieved the world's first controlled flight on December 17th, 1903, outside of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which, as we say, is a whole episode in itself.
It is.
Soon, a new era of aviation would begin. In time, airplanes would dominate the sky, and even great airships such as the Hindenburg had their golden age in the early 20th century. With all these new flying machines buzzing about, there was little room left for hot air balloons. Even though balloons would no longer have any use as a practical form of transportation, they would continue to be of great use to science. One example of this was when an historic balloon flight initially began in the town of Augsburg in Germany. The pilots were Swiss scientists August Picard and Paul Kipfer. On May 27, 1931, the scientists took off from Augsburg and would ascend not just into the sky, but into the heavens beyond. They would reach an altitude of 15,781 kilometers, or about 51,775 feet. So that's 20,000 feet above a commercial airliner.
Wow. That's talk about intense, especially for the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, to be up that high.
Making them the first humans to travel to the stratosphere and the first to view the curvature of the Earth, and they did not do this in a rocket, but in a hot air balloon. The flight resulted in gathering new information about the upper atmosphere and also information about cosmic rays. Aside from this expedition, Picard would leave an enduring legacy. He would be the main inspiration for the character of Professor Calculus in the Adventures of Tintin comics created by Belgian artist Hergé. Now, if anyone's not super familiar with those, there was a Steven Spielberg motion cap movie, which was The Adventures of Tintin. Did you see that one?
I did, Yep.
His legacy went beyond comics, however. His own family would also carry on the tradition of exploration he started. After the balloon flight, August would invent the bathyscaphe, not sure, a type of submarine that was designed to withstand high pressures. Jacques Picard and American Don Walsh, with the help of the submarine, would be the first humans to reach the Challenger deep in the Mariana Trench. But that is another story to tell. Another person that would eventually do that solo is James Cameron.
There we go.
Yep. Not all daredevils have used submarines to reach new frontiers in the human experience. In the 1950s, another intrepid explorer would ascend to the heavens to study cosmic rays, much like Auguste Picard. However, the flight of the United States Air Force pilot Joseph Kinniger would be much different compared to the early flight. He was part of a project called Elixir, which was primarily used to experiment with parachute jumps from high altitude. So this is very early space age. I mean, the Germans had been messing around with the V-2 rockets. Of course, we had brought those scientists, a lot of them, over to here. And so now they're just kind of playing with this idea. On the ascent that occurred in August of 1960, he jumped from an altitude of over 100,000 feet and safely landed at his target in the New Mexican desert. So it's a little bit of a morning commute.
That is a slight morning commute. My gosh, 100,000 feet.
He also broke the free fall speed record by falling on over 600 miles per hour.
Wow. Terminal velocity at its best right there.
They had airliners back then, so you're just flying along, you're reading your magazine, you're having your Don Draper cocktail, and suddenly you just see this.
What was that?
So it seems like it'd be a tradition. It's just this is kind of like the first the other guy doing the parachutes just jumping off his house. People are watching this now. They're just watching that airplane. It's just nothing's really changed other than the distance.
You'd probably do a little second take at the drink after you saw that. Going, man, I gotta cut back here.
His record would not be beat until 2012 by Felix Baumgartner of Red Bull, and later by Alan Eustace in 2014. So those guys went even up higher and jumped even further.
Well, and what a drastic distance and difference in technology between those folks.
Even though humans would reach the moon in the 1916, or 1960s, 1916? Yeah. There's a conspiracy theory for you. Ballooning was still on the minds of the world's most intrepid inventors at the end of the century and innovators. One of these individuals was British entrepreneur Richard Branson. Sir Richard Branson, as he would eventually become known, is best known for founding Virgin Group, an empire of over 300 different brands and businesses that operate all over the globe. Other than business, Branson has always had the taste for adventure. Besides his own curiosity, he used this aspect of his personality to help promote the Virgin Group, and in this case, his airline Virgin Galactic. One of his earliest endeavors was crossing the Atlantic by boat in record time, but his ambitions would eventually look toward the horizons. In 1987, Branson, along with Swede Per Lindstrand, would leave from Sugarloaf, Maine. They would continue to travel over the Atlantic until they reached land on the other side of the pond and would briefly touch down outside of Derry in Northern Ireland. I say briefly because nearby power lines caused them to alter their flight path. To avoid the power lines, the balloon ended up crashing into the Irish Sea at speeds at over 100 miles per hour, and Branson and Lindstrand were forced to jump from the balloon into the water. Oh, I wonder who pushed who first.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Eventually, they were both rescued and were in good health. Despite the eventful ending, they managed to beat the standing Atlantic balloon record. With the pond behind him, Branson then set out a new goal of crossing the Pacific, which was twice as far as the Atlantic. In January of 1991, Branson and Pear this time would depart from the land of the rising sun, Japan. The intention was to fly from Japan and then land in Southern California, over 8,000 miles away. This did not happen, though. At one point during the flight, some of the fuel tanks had fallen from the balloon, leaving the crew with not enough resources to reach their destination. So a little bit of a oh crap moment there.
Oh, no kidding.
In an interview with Business Insider, Branson highlighted this incident. He said, quote, "Everything went wrong. We lost 2/3 of our fuel. We were only 1,000 miles into the trip, with 7,000 more miles to go. We had to average 180 miles per hour in a balloon to make a cross. I was facing almost certain death. We could have just slumped on the floor and accepted our fate, or tried to fly the balloon into the core of the jet stream and find the strongest winds you can find, stay awake for 3 days, and do everything you can to avoid what, on paper, looked like a sad ending. In order to stay afloat, this is exactly what they did. Traveling in the jet stream even helped them break a new record when the craft reached speeds of 245 miles per hour. Within 2 days, both Branson and Purr had achieved their goal of being the first to cross the Pacific. Although very off course, they did not land in Southern California as planned, since the jet stream dumped them into the Northwest Territories in Canada, almost 3,000 miles north of Los Angeles.
Oh, man.
They stick their head out of that thing. They're like, there's some Canadian guy in a snowmobile. Oh, you look a bit lost there, you know, eh?
Yeah, hey. Pretty high mountaintops.
Even with these lucky successes, Branson was not done. Now he wanted the world. A voyage that would circle the entire planet in a hot air balloon. Branson, for the first time, makes a series of 4 unsuccessful attempts to do so. Yes, 4. Some of the more noteworthy events included an incident when they accidentally flew over the Himalayas into Chinese airspace, causing the Air Force to almost blast the balloon out of the sky. A series of British diplomats managed to fix the situation, but the mission was already compromised.
Oh my God.
Another faux pas occurred when Branson's team crash-landed in the Saharan desert. Things escalated when they were all kidnapped by an Algerian warlord and held captive for a period of time until they were released soon afterward. Branson would later describe their hostage conditions as luxurious. I don't know what that exactly means. It's like, would you like some champagne and a little caviar, before we possibly execute you? I mean, I don't...
Precisely. What does that look like in that scenario?
Sir Richard Branson would eventually end his ballooning adventures and later concentrate his efforts on space with Virgin Galactic when another team had beaten him to the punch at being the first to circumnavigate the globe in a balloon. Now, this was written before the recent space flight he's just achieved, which, of course, he was a success. So, I knew a little bit about him and the balloons. I didn't really know the fine details. But I'm just reading all this, just like, this guy needs, if any rich person needs a movie, this guy needs a movie.
He does. It's actually, when you think about all the stuff that he did over the years, especially what we just talked about, I'm surprised there hasn't been one made already.
Now, the guys that beat him, as it would turn out, one of the pilots is a relation to one of our old friends, Bertrend Picard, the grandson of Auguste Picard. Now, he's the guy that first got up to 50,000 feet. Bertrand would continue the family legacy of exploration when he began his journey around the world in Breitling Orbiter 3, a balloon with a pressurized capsule that was about 5 meters in length or 18 feet. Now, imagine the pressure of this guy. Everyone has discovered or done something big. It's like
yeah, how do you make precedents on top of those people that came before you?
It's like, my dad, he's a plumber, I'm a plumber, I'm content. Oh, yeah, my grandfather, he discovered, the stratosphere.
Yeah, how do you top that? No pun intended.
3 Breitling orbiters had been constructed, but Orbiter 3 would prove to be the most successful one. Like most adventurous flights, Bertrand would be joined by a co-pilot, in this case Englishman Brian Jones. And no, not the one from the Rolling Stones. Why'd you bring Brian Jones? I just wanted to hear some sick guitar riffs.
There we go.
On that note, as a fun fact, the balloons were manufactured by Cameron Balloons based out of Bristol, England. Which reminds me, do you remember Raven Precision Ag Equipment?
I do.
They originally were and still are a hot air balloon manufacturer.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that even back when I was around the Raven equipment.
Mm-hmm. My dad went to their headquarters, and part of it was fabric for balloons. The other half was all their precision electronic stuff.
Wow.
If I remember that correctly, but yeah.
Jeez, well, they were a pioneer on a couple of different fronts.
Mm-hmm. The pair would begin their journey in the small alpine village of Château d'Eau on March 1st, 1999. They took off from the alpine village with the grand ambition of being the first people to travel around the Earth in a hot air balloon. Not only did they know if they would not know if they would be successful, they also did not know if they would survive the voyage. Both Bertrand and Brian would spend a lot of their time in the pressurized gondola, making sure they were on course by routinely checking their various instruments. They would spend 8 hours at the controls alone, 8 hours working with each other, and would then spend 8 hours in their cramped sleeping quarters. At one point during the trip, they were forced to consider changing their route over the Pacific Ocean due to unfortunate weather. This seems to be a common occurrence. They did not have the choice of an alternative route, but they did have a choice of an alternative route, but it would be slower. With this in mind, they only had 2 choices: risk death, or simply arrive at their destination a little later. Obviously, they chose the second option.
Yeah, naturally.
To keep them company, they had an original copy of 5 Weeks in a Balloon, an early novel by Jules Verne, one of the fathers of science fiction. It had been loaned to them by Verne's grandson from the family's own library. I don't know if I'd even want to read it. I'd be nervous.
I would as well, especially with how famous he was. I mean, today and then especially back then. I mean, that's incredible.
Mm. They would experience some troubles along the way. Even though the gondola was heated, due to the high altitudes, the temperature would drop to the point that the water in the capsule would freeze, causing them to break the ice that was against the walls with important electrical components. So you don't want to miss your tapping is what's going on there.
Yeah.
Oh, need I forget, they had access to only one specialized pressurized toilet with nothing but curtains for privacy.
Oh my gosh. It's like being in space.
Yeah. Not all the trip was studiously studying instruments. At one point, the crew was forced to lower so that they could throw out vital supplies in order to keep afloat. Despite the freezing water, supply loss, and swashbuckling toilet experiences, the crew had managed to achieve their goal when they reached Mauritania on March 19th. They had traveled a distance of 40,816 kilometers, or 25,361 miles.
Wow.
The voyage lasted for 19 days, 21 hours, and 47 minutes, also breaking the record for the longest aircraft afloat at the time. Bertrand and Brian would finally land in Egypt near the pyramids of Giza to celebrate the occasion. So that's hundreds of years to do that, to reach that point.
Seriously, I mean, any of the little experimentation to even get there.
Ballooning may not be as prominent as it has been in the past, but it's still a popular activity in the current world of aviation. There are many clubs and events with passionate participants that continue the tradition of the hot air balloon. In the early 20th century, humankind would first take to the sky in airplanes. Shortly afterward, the invention of flight would be used for the atrocities of military use. Fortunately, in the middle of that century, flight would be taken over by peaceful and cooperative civilians for commercial passenger liners made by the likes of Boeing and Airbus and the space programs of the West and the Soviet Union. In the 21st century, entrepreneurs would work in league with the established space organizations of the preceding century. Currently, a new space race for the first time in decades is in progress, but above all these individuals and organizations owe their existence to the hot air balloon pioneers who were active centuries before them. If it was not for Da Vinci and the Wright brothers and their dreams of flying through the sky, we would simply not have the airplanes, zeppelins, and rockets that carry us to the sky and beyond the planet we call home. On the other hand, as amazing as all these things are, we would not have any of these innovations without the endeavors of the early aviators and their balloons. In the end, the invention of the hot air balloon started our ascent to greater understanding of what lies beyond the horizon and continues to inspire our interest in flight in a way that can only be described as both fascinating and, above all else, epic.
It truly does.
And that is the end of our story. So how was that for something that's totally off the beaten path from terrestrial vehicles?
I think it kind of goes back to the original perspective of flight. I mean, you look at a bird, and a lot of birds, especially larger ones, don't move incredibly fast, but to just achieve that that goal of being, airborne.
The sunglasses, aviators. I believe that these were originally designed for balloonists because they're up so high and sunlight was causing them to partially go blind, and so they wanted something that was, functional yet elegant. And this is essentially the design that I'm holding a pair right now that sunglass manufacturers have not gone far away from.
It's interesting, and that's very true. I mean, that would make a lot of sense, especially considering the conditions they had to operate in.
Now, there actually is hot air balloon stories, movies, of course. Interestingly enough, another Jules Verne story, which is Around the World in 80 Days. On the covers of a lot of the books, there's usually always a hot air balloon illustration. And in the book, they didn't really do that. So it's a faux pas in a lot of those editions.
It is. Yeah. That's a good point. That's a good point. I have one of the unabridged editions of Around the World in 80 Days, and it is just that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, like the movie adaptions kind of use balloons too. Maybe to add to the atmosphere. Another good one I saw was the Aeronauts, and that came out a year or two ago. They took a lot of historical liberties. It was based off of real flight. But if you just kind of get past that, the movie itself is really good. If you have any height fears, I wouldn't recommend watching it because it was about an historical flight where they get up to like 30,000 feet. And there's literally this scene where the main female actress, she wakes up unconscious, tethered from the basket, hanging underneath it at 30,000 feet, just looking down. And I don't have a fear of heights, but even I was like, no, thank you.
No. Another movie that comes to my mind, anyways, from a child is The Rocketeer. Yep. You get the experience of what it would be like to be on one of those from some of the scenes in the movie, and then again when one goes the route of the Zeppelin when it's ignited, and pretty incredible visuals as far as especially for its day.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said before we begin this is our season final. We're going to start wrapping things up for a bit here. We are hoping to be back with new material in the near future. Of course, we're on Patreon. We appreciate your support. We like good likes. Pass us on to your friends. And we will catch you next time when we start our next Joyride.
Yes, we will, and the best is yet to come.
All
so
right.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, and thank you everyone for listening. Signing out. Starstruck.